2025, Canadians will face the dilemma of having to make a decision about who will be their next prime minister, knowing very little about the man who has become our prime minister. So today's commentary is entitled Carneyage. Will our new prime minister be the final architect of Canada's demise? We begin with a quotation from Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, "If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." About 250 years ago, there was a war of independence between the British Empire and what would become the United States of America. The sparsely populated remaining British colonies of North America were invaded by mass immigration from the former 13 southern colonies. Approximately 80,000 British subjects fled north to settle in what is now Ontario, which then had a population of only about 8,000 persons. Canada would be forever changed and shaped by this mass of invaders who called themselves the United Empire Loyalists, or UEL. The UEL was a leftist euphemism to disguise who they were and why they fled the new republic to find refuge up north. You see, it was not just British rule that the Americans rejected. It was the entire administrative bureaucratic state, tax and customs collectors, harbor masters and magistrates, governors and clergymen, royal surveyors and sheriffs. The UEL represented the entire class of patronage appointees who were the face of British oppression, and so they had to flee. Upon their arrival in Canada, the UEL promptly established the same oppressive patronage system and awarded themselves the very authorities and privileges stripped away by the American Revolution. In Canada, we would soon coin a new term for the UEL, the Family Compact. They awarded themselves the choicest tracts of land, the best proprietary licenses for trade and commerce, and created an educational system propagandizing a legend about the UEL as heroic loyalists, disguising their shameful betrayal of the 13 colonies. Their ensuing corruption and oppression would soon cause other rebellions in Lower and Upper Canada between 1837 and 1839. The Family Compact, or Chateau Clique as they were known in Quebec, were never dissolved or defeated. Today, they are known as the Laurentian elite, and they control the political establishment through ownership of the Liberal Party of Canada and the Conservative Party of Canada. They also have deep globalist ties to the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, the European Union, and other such groups exerting dominant influence in Canadian politics. But what the Laurentian elite still fears above all else is America and its ability to destroy the UEL stranglehold over Canadians. It is why they created the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC, to keep out American media and cultural influence. It is why Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, and his chief rival in the upcoming federal election, Pierre Poilievre, have joined forces as Team Canada in their elbows up campaign against the dreaded Orange Man in Washington. The long-awaited Canadian general election is now a reality. But will its outcome save our nation and rehabilitate us for posterity? Or will it further entrench the UEL and hasten our continuing decline? A small coterie of the UEL recently selected central banker and World Economic Forum acolyte Mark Carney as our new prime minister. He only just became a politician, but the UEL have already vaulted him to the head of the class. He had been Trudeau's chief economic advisor since 2020, designing all of the catastrophic liberal COVID-19 policies. When asked to critique Trudeau's economic policies by a street reporter, he once quipped, quote, It is a bad idea to ask a banker to answer political questions." End quote. No worries, though. He has the kind of CV that any globalist in good standing with Klaus Schwab would envy. He ran not only the Bank of Canada, but also the Bank of England. You see, he is a citizen of Ireland and of the UK, as well as Canada. A real patriot in the UEL mold. A central banker par excellence. He loves printing funny money and manipulating markets. Artificially created inflation and financial emergencies are his forte. Carney is the most recent iteration of the WEF's standard operating procedure for captured governments like Canada. Whenever possible, put bankers in charge of those pesky territorial designations nostalgically called nation-states. France's Emmanuel Macron was a Rothschild & Company investment banker. Former UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was a Goldman Sachs and hedge fund guru. Do not be at all surprised when more transnational bankers seemingly come out of nowhere to dominate the politics of other so-called sovereign countries. Investment banking, and especially central banking, is the lifeblood of globalism. Why, you ask? Well, because once a bank is big enough, it gambles with the futures of entire nations and the lives of their citizens as if they were so many poker chips. After central banker Carney completes Canada's transition to a green energy-reliant vassal state of the International Money Printing Guild, who will shed a tear for Canadians? Carney lays out his Marxist vision for Canada and the world in his 2021 book entitled Values. Carney here presents a boldly urgent argument favoring the radical, foundational change that WEF elites think is required to build an economy and society based not upon market values, but upon social justice, which he affectionately calls human values. Carney claims that our world is full of fault lines: growing inequality in income and opportunity, systemic racism, health and economic crises from a global pandemic, mistrust of experts, the existential threat of climate change, and deep threats to employment in a digital economy with robotics and AI on the rise. Carney argues that these fundamental problems and others like them stem from a common crisis in values. Drawing upon the turmoil of the last decade, which he helped engineer, Carney argues that market economies have evolved into market societies, where price determines the value of everything. If this sounds rather like repackaged Marxism, it is because that is precisely what it is. According to Carney, when we think about what we value most highly, we might list fairness, health, protection of individual rights, economic security from poverty, preservation of natural diversity, resources, and beauty. The tragedy is that these things we hold dearest are too often casualties of our 21st century world, where they ought to be our bedrock. Then, as always with Marxists, comes the utopian vision. Carney offers his dream of a more humane society and a practical manifesto for getting there. How we reform our infrastructure to make things better and fairer is at the heart of every chapter, with outlines of his neo-Marxist ideas to restructure society and enshrine woke values at the core of every institution. Naturally, this entails a great reset to a net zero economy and reorganization of Canadian society along social justice lines that surrender individual sovereignty to the state in exchange for protection from the evils of capitalism. Did we neglect to mention that Carney became fabulously wealthy via capitalism? So Canada today is a hornet's nest of globalists, communists, and wokeness. A WEF-engineered winter is most definitely coming for us. Of course, Canada is but one territory being pursued in the globalist board game of central bank risk. They are rolling the dice and capturing lands all over the world. If Western-style democracy means that central bankers like Carney control domestic policy, stifle dissent, and decide when war is profitable, then perhaps citizens should start asking who on earth put them in charge. In Carney's case, it certainly was not we the people. Since early November of last year, the spectacle of Donald Trump's second administration has featured unprovoked attacks upon Canada and our economy. The implications for Canada's interests and global standing are both serious and stark. For those who have for decades been called protectionist, anti-globalist, and economic nationalists because of their advocacy for sovereignty approaches, the sudden eruption of Team Canada strategies is rather shocking. Those who previously mocked economic nationalism as protectionist are now all in. And so it is only fair to ask, where were these fierce elbows-up defenders of sovereignty when Canada was slowly and systematically eroding its own economic prosperity and national security? In 2020, Trump advisor Jared Kushner publicly admitted their strategy to fashion a trade agreement with Canada that weaponized uncertainty so that the U.S. could come back in 6 years for more trade concessions. So, here we are. Biden's own trade representative extended Trump's weaponization strategy, saying that, quote, discomfort is actually a feature, not a bug, end quote. Why did Carney and the Liberals fail to heed these public warnings and build resiliency and leverage in areas wherever feasible? No nation with Canada's potential deliberately inflicts so much damage upon its own economic prosperity and sovereignty. The new economic nationalists will find much to pearl clutch in most of our industrial policy, and none of it will have Trump's name on it. Canada was built upon sovereign institutions and approaches for production economy realms like energy, agriculture, mining, communications, transportation, and finance. By completely missing the advent of the knowledge economy in the 1980s, it has lost the plot. That has cost us billions of dollars annually in national accounts and in leverage that could have given us more strength around the negotiating table. Meanwhile, as Canada prepares for the upcoming election, past statements by Carney are raising eyebrows, including a comment about whether there should be, quote, a market in the right to have children, end quote. Buried within his 2021 book and past BBC lectures, Carney explores the controversial ideas of Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel, whom Carney cites as a key influence. Carney posed stunning questions about whether society should place a price tag on fundamental rights. He asks, quote, should sex be up for sale? Should there be a market in the right to have children? Why not auction the right to opt out of military service? End quote. These questions are not new and have been noted by Carney's many critics, but are lately resurfacing as we learn more about our mysterious new prime minister. In Values, Carney probes deeply the deadly ideas of communists like Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin. He uses them as a springboard to push for a worldview by which free markets are tightly controlled to accommodate his twin pillars, environmental and social justice. Carney argues that the pursuit of profit has led to moral decay and driven us all into a climate emergency. In his book, Carney admonishes politicians who abandon carbon taxes, saying that they should be held accountable by voters, despite doing the very same thing himself once it became politically expedient. Carney also advocates for central bank digital currencies to replace the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency, comparing their potential introduction to the fear used to implement pandemic measures. Carney also has the history of injecting diversity, inclusion, equity ideology into his workplaces and supports identity-based hiring. During a recent press conference, he stated that wokeness will continue in Canada regardless of what is happening in the United States. Despite attempts to present himself as a fresh start for the Liberals, his past statements and marriage to out-of-touch ideas are fast catching up to him. His thinking reflects radical left-wing policies leading to government control over personal freedoms, raising serious questions about what an unbridled Carney regime could mean for Canadians. For instance, in February of 2022, Carney wrote a controversial editorial published in the Globe and Mail entitled, "This is Sedition, and it's time to end it in Ottawa." In it, Carney claims that peaceful protesters were making residents' lives hell, and that their actions were terrorizing women fleeing abuse and harassing the elderly, preventing them from leaving their homes to shop for groceries. Carney further opined that donating to the Freedom Convoy amounted to supporting insurrection, and called for decisive action to protect Canadians and their democracy. He stated, quote, "It's time to end the sedition in Ottawa by enforcing the law and following the money," end quote. Carney was already a key figure in Prime Minister Trudeau's inner circle at that point, and so it is difficult not to conclude that he was publicly building the case for what Trudeau ultimately did: illegally freeze bank accounts, unjustifiably invoke the Emergencies Act, and launch a crackdown that violated the charter rights of every Canadian, scarring forever our country's international reputation as a nation which protects the individual rights and freedoms of its citizens. Carney also described the protest leaders as no longer simply advocating for a different strategy to end the COVID-19 pandemic, but as deliberately and purposefully undermining democracy and the rule of law. He emphasized that those helping to extend the occupation must be identified and punished to the full force of the law. These are chilling words, considering that Tamara Lich, Chris Barber, and others are still facing criminal prosecution, and that there are multiple pending civil suits concerning what happened in Ottawa during the Freedom Convoy. Carney's militant stance on the Freedom Convoy was also reflected more recently by his immediate selection of Marco Mendicino as his first chief of staff. Mendicino was previously criticized for making false statements about Freedom Convoy protesters, including alleging that they made rape threats, which he used to justify invocation of the Emergencies Act. He was caught lying publicly that law enforcement agencies asked for the Emergencies Act to be used to end the Freedom Convoy. Mendicino played a key role in controversial gun ban legislation framed to the public as a ban on handguns, but he later secretly amended it to include prohibitions on a number of sport hunting rifles and shotguns. Then, in 2023, as heightened international tensions arose over CCP surveillance of North America via balloons, he argued that any laws targeting foreign spies must be inclusive and done in a culturally sensitive manner. In fact, Mendicino became such a political pariah that Trudeau dropped him from cabinet in 2023, along with several other COVID-era ministers. Many Canadians are thus sounding the alarm over this recent appointment by Carney, reminding Canadians of Mendicino's tyrannical record while serving as Trudeau's public safety minister. Pierre Poilievre posted this comment on his X account, quote, "Mark Carney's chief of staff is none other than Trudeau's ex-public safety immigration minister, Marco Mendicino. He's the guy forced to resign after he moved mass murderer and serial rapist Paul Bernardo out of a maximum security prison, allowed gun crimes to surge 116%, did nothing to stop Beijing's foreign interference in Canada's democracy, helped Trudeau break our immigration system. Nothing has changed. Did these guys really deserve a fourth term?" End quote. This is, of course, the key question which Canadian voters must answer when we go to the polls on the 28th of April, 2025. Prime Minister Carney has officially asked the Governor-General to dissolve our prorogue parliament and trigger a federal election. This means that federal parties like the CPC will have just 37 days to campaign, the minimum required by law, as the Liberals seek a contentious fourth consecutive term without former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the helm. Poilievre spoke in Gatineau, Quebec, just before the recent election call was made by Carney. Quote, "Today, the Liberals are asking for a fourth term in power after swapping Justin Trudeau for his economic advisor and his hand-picked successor, Mark Carney. But after a lost Liberal decade, the question is whether Canadians can't afford a fourth Liberal term," end quote. He accused the Liberals of inflating housing costs, pushing Canadians to resort to food banks, wrecking our immigration system, and making Canada's economy totally reliant upon the United States. Carney held a press conference soon after meeting with the Governor-General at Rideau Hall in Ottawa. Quote, "I'm asking for a strong, positive mandate for my fellow Canadians. I've just requested that the Governor-General dissolve Parliament and call for an election for April 28th, and she has agreed." End quote. Carney took office on the 14th of March, just a week after winning the Liberal leadership in a vote that saw fewer than half of registered party members participate. The Liberal Party also disqualified 2 current MPs from the leadership race, both of whom had garnered substantial support. Carney is Canada's only Prime Minister never previously voted to any elected office. So Carney will be running in the Ottawa riding of Nepean. Liberal MP Chandra Arya has held the riding, but the Liberals recently denied his candidacy for re-election after summarily disqualifying his bid to lead the party. The leadership race itself and Carney's ensuing ascent to power was decided by only around 150,000 Liberal Party members. The timing of the election call has raised eyebrows, with it occurring just one day before Parliament was set to resume and the Liberals gaining ground in the polls. Trudeau had previously prorogued Parliament. Carney has attempted to capitalize on a change of leadership by presenting himself as an outsider, but many of his cabinet picks signal more of the same old Liberals. The election will be fought against the backdrop of increasingly hostile tariffs in the U.S. and even talk of annexation by Trump. Despite Liberal attempts to portray Poilievre as a Trump ally, the U.S. president recently told Fox News that he would prefer to deal with a Liberal in charge. Trump described Poilievre's criticisms of his administration as negative and claimed that the CP seater was, quote, "not a MAGA guy," end quote. Carney's brief time in the PMO has thus far seen him completely ignore the caretaker doctrine followed by previously unelected Canadian prime ministers. He has lowered the consumer portion of the carbon tax to zero, but retained carbon pricing legislation. He traveled abroad for meetings with European leaders and made a trip to Nunavut to announce a defense partnership with Australia, which a former top Canadian general called an electioneering campaign stunt. Carney then met with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, but pledged to keep Trudeau's oil and gas sector cap in place. After spending a day skating with the NHL Edmonton Oilers and getting a shutout from Captain Connor McDavid, Carney pledged $100 million of taxpayers' money to Palestine. Finally, he controversially appointed mass immigration lobbyist and Century Initiative co-founder Mark Wiseman as a Canada-U.S. relations advisor. Carney also faces scrutiny over his financial holdings, initially denying any conflicts of interest. He later admitted that he may need to recuse himself from certain government decisions if elected prime minister. He is still owed nearly $7 million in stock options from Brookfield Asset Management, where he served as CEO prior to his leadership bid. Brookfield has an exclusive contract with the Department of National Defense for all military relocations, paying Brookfield many millions in annual brokerage fees. But perhaps the most concerning thing about Carney is what the British have to say about him. The British have been far more negative and critical in their analysis, including from left-leaning pundits. Indeed, the dislike of Carney on both sides of the British political spectrum is rather remarkable. So, what is our country in for under a Carney regime? According to Larry Elliott, who served for nearly 3 decades as economics editor of the left-wing UK daily The Guardian, he penned a fascinating op-ed about Carney on the 11th of March 2025. It is a dreary portrayal of the man. Quote, "From the moment he took over as governor from Mervyn King in 2013, it was clear Carney considered himself to be the smartest man in the room and wanted to make sure everybody knew it. He was not a man to suffer fools gladly." End quote. While he was, quote, "intellectually self-confident and worked ferociously hard," end quote, Elliott noted that Carney had a, quote, "central banker's caution when it came to public statements. His answers to questions often went on for several minutes, making them pretty much unquotable. Given a 30-minute slot, I realized after 25 minutes that he had said nothing that would remotely make a news story. There was another side to Carney's character. Journalists sometimes caught a glimpse of his volcanic temper, and bank staff were wary of getting on the wrong side of him. As a governor, he was respected, but not especially liked, end quote. Matthew Lynn's March 10th column for the right-leaning Daily Telegraph was remarkably similar. Quote, "It takes only a cursory glance to work out that Carney's reputation is completely overblown. In reality, he has been overpromoted all over again. Over the 8 years at the Bank of England, Carney was at best an indifferent governor, and at worst, a disappointing failure," end quote. Despite his huge 600,000 British pounds annual salary, more than any of his predecessors had been paid, he showed little feel for the role. By the time Carney left the Bank of England in 2021, he had, quote, "created a mess which his successors have struggled to clear up. Inflation spiked to a peak of 11.1% in the UK, largely because the bank had printed too much money. Carney is the epitome of a remote, globalized, technocratic elite. He's very good at self-promotion, at collecting trophy jobs, and of course, negotiating fabulously generous salaries and expenses for himself along the way. He's just not very good at delivering," end quote. Canadians must keep these British analyses in mind as we head to the polls. Indeed, the British media has warned us about Carney for years. Many on the left and right disliked him and often spoke out strongly against him. The Liberal Party of Canada were either unaware or chose to throw caution to the wind concerning Carney. The most damning comments about Carney, however, come from former British Prime Minister Liz Truss, who recently stated this in a podcast interview. Quote, "Well, Mark Carney was governor of the Bank of England, and under his tenure, too much money was printed, which did damage the British economy and put our economy off track. It's been a disaster for Britain. The country is heading for bankruptcy, so I would strongly recommend not backing Mark Carney or his policies on net zero, which have been disastrous for Britain, will be disastrous for Canada. I believe that he made major mistakes in the mismanagement of the Bank of England. He has pushed net zero, which has been a disaster, not just for the UK, but for many countries around the world," end quote. So, now that you know a bit more about this enigmatic man, Canada, it is now for all of you to decide whether to cast your vote for or against the coming Carneyage. The result of the upcoming election might very well mark the dawn of our shared national rehabilitation, or else plunge us irretrievably into the abyss of history where once proud nations go to die. We end with a quotation from Ludwig von Mises, who wrote, "There is no more dangerous menace to civilization than a government of incompetent, corrupt, or vile men."